Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're here today to speak with Iris Apfel and Massimo Alois and Anthony Chinami, the publisher of the Wall Street Journal, to discuss their family connection and the many years of history that go back from the beginning of Old World Weavers with your family, and then to also talk about how you've rebuilt the vineyards in the region of Caserta, and hear some stories of you both being together.
I, as a little boy, coming from, my parents are from Caserta. They're expat Italians who live in the United States, and we spent every summer on vacation in Italy. And I thought that I had a wonderful childhood, and a lot of my life is very, very positive because I've only been exposed to the positive. And as a little boy, visiting Caserta, which is the ancestral village of my parents, we would visit. There's a palace in Caserta called the Royal Palace of Caserta. The architect was Vanvitelli, and it was built by Bourbon kings when they were in control of the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or the kingdom of Napoli, which was what it was also known as. And visiting this palace as a little boy, as 7, 8 years old, and running through its corridors, and in those days it was the early 70s, and we were allowed more access to the palace than we are today, especially if you came from the area and you knew people. But we were always allowed, and I used to sit on the lions at the bottom of the staircase, and everybody would see these pictures of me on the lions and say, "But where are you? Are you in France?" I would think, "No, I'm not in France, I'm in Caserta. It looks like Versailles." They were like, "But what are you doing with a palace like that?" And I would actually ask these questions over and over again as a little boy. My father would talk to me about how there were kings that lived here and how there were queens that lived here. And then we went up a few feet higher up a hill to an area that he was in love with because it had a beautiful view. It's called Belvedere, and it's known as San Leocho. And San Leocho is surrounded by amazing mulberry trees. And my father would explain to me that the mulberry trees would create silk, and that the people that lived there were amazing silk makers. And I'm like, "What's a silk maker?" He goes, "Well, the shirts that you have and the shirts that I have in the days in the early 70s, silk shirts were big. Exactly. However, these are not silks that you wear. These are silks that were adorned on major palaces throughout the whole world. The people who lived here created textiles and design for very privileged, wealthy people throughout the country, which we don't have in the United States, but you see a lot of Americans who are very obsessed with royalty." And I said, "I'm one of those Americans that was obsessed with royalty." And I fell in love with this area and rediscovered it. And then about 2 years ago, I tasted a wine that I really enjoyed very much, and it came from the same village from where my parents were from, actually from the other side of the hill. And it's from a little area called Ponte Latone. And I went and visited Ponte Latone, and on the drive there, I was like, this is one of the most amazing drives. It was clean, it was pristine. There were Roman ruins hidden in certain areas. There was limestone and volcanic. And I knocked on the door of this vineyard, and I met Massimo Alois, and he was really, really charming. And I said, "Alois," and I looked up the name Alois, and I remember my father talking to me about them, and they were known, the townspeople would call them I Signori. And I Signori, I don't know if it really exists anymore in that town, but it really refers to people who are somewhat aristocratic. But in Massimo's case, it's really aristocratic because his lineage actually comes from aristocratic people who were part of the royal court of Caserta. So the vineyard that he is on was actually there were grapes that were rediscovered by his father about 30, 40 years ago, Palagrello grapes and Casavecchia grapes. And I tasted these wines and I listened to his stories, and I was completely transported, and I very much enjoyed it because wine cannot be enjoyed just by standing and drinking wine at a cocktail. You need to eat it with food, and you need to have an experience with it. And when I met him at his vineyard, he took us down into his cantina, and in his cantina, below the ground, he had all these books that housed invoices from major American and international companies that would buy silks, and one of them was Old World Weavers. And Old World Weavers, it brought to mind, I was like, oh, Iris Apfel. She was Old World Weavers. Tell me about what you did. And he said, well, she used to come here and she discovered our silk factories and brought them to America during the Truman era.
During when?
The Truman era.
Yeah.
It was the Truman era, correct. So I thought, as publisher of WSJ Magazine, it would be really nice to do this favor, since we've all become friends, and to hear these stories more today, and what the story is behind Massimo. So I brought David Scott, who's a renowned interior designer and a very good friend, Iris Apfel, who we all know as a fashion icon and interior designer and a search engine for her friends and family. She's not on the internet. She doesn't do email. She converses with people, and I think that conversing with people is much more effective than anything in digital. And of course, Massimo Alois, who's an 8th descendant?
Yeah, I would say maybe the 10th. Yeah,
10th.
10th.
10th descendant. So tell us a little bit more about your background, Massimo.
Yeah, I mean, the Alois family originally came from France in the 16th century. And then they actually were part of the nobility, as you said, you know, of the Bourbon kings, because the Bourbon kings came in the 18th century, and we were part of their royal court. And the Bourbon kings were always competing with the French. So that's why they built this big factory for making the fabrics for the garments of the lady of the court. And the Alois family was in charge of this manufacturing plant that they built in San Leucio, which is a small town, is a closed city, close to the royal palace of Caserta. And so we have always been making fabrics, you know. And we got to know, you know, the Apfel family, you know, after the Second World War. So we've been in the silk business for more than 2 centuries, actually.
Can you tell us how, specifically, how your grandfather, Giovanni, came to meet the Apfels?
Yeah, actually, I'm happy to share, you know, what I understand as the first meeting. But Iris and Carl actually came to know my grandfather longer than me, because since my grandfather died 1 year before I was born. And I remember, you know, having, I remember them coming over, you know, to San Leucio, you know, and spend time with us. And, you know, at that time, I think it was not that, the connection, I mean, the transportation was not that comfortable, you know, and...
Yeah, speaking of transportation, Iris, as you actually met Massimo's grandfather in person, can you talk about arriving in Caserta by ship and being picked up in a carriage by Mr. Alois?
I remember it vaguely. I don't remember Grandpa too well because I knew his uncle quite well, who was really quite a character.
Angelina.
And Angelina, his wife, was a beautiful lady who was one of the best cooks I've ever come upon. And she also used to tell me, you better eat. This is very funny because the plates would be stacked up and you'd start at the top, you know, maybe there'd be 10 plates. And I had the misfortune to, the first time, say, oh God, this is delicious. Immediately, a second portion of the same thing. So I learned not to compliment anything because I gained about 12 pounds at every sitting. Anyway, not only that, but sometimes she would stuff me so I couldn't handle it. So she gave me something called, at the end of every meal, they took out a bottle of Herbamil. It was a digestive medication, which they subsequently took off the market because they found that it contained some morphine, which was very Italian in those days.
And what days were those?
Well, this was in the 50s. Everything was so... We came to Italy the first time with, did you know the Bologna family?
No.
Well, he was a really master weaver. He was absolutely sensational. He came over, I guess he must have come in the late 40s or the 50s, and he brought some looms with him, and he set up a little place of his own in Patterson, where a lot of silk people were working. And he would weave the most divine fabrics for French and Company, and he started to sell to Scalamandre and whatnot, and he didn't like that at all. He wanted his own business. And subsequent, I met, by chance, I met his daughter at school, and she used to tell me about him and tell me how wonderful he was. And some years later, when I was in the interior design business, I wanted a fabric which didn't exist. I had it in my head, and I went to every fabric source in New York, and nobody had it, and I was tearing my hair, and I ran into her, and I told her my problem, and she said, well, why don't you bring the sketch over to Papa, go over to the mill in Long Island City, and if he likes it, he'll weave it for you. So I did, and he wove it, and it was a big success. And so he said, do you have any more designs? And I said, oh, I have a few, and I brought some, and he loved them, and he made them, and they were very successful. So he said, how would you like to go into business with me? I don't want to weave for other people, I want to weave for myself. I'll manage the mill, you do the designing, and your husband can do the business. So we kicked it around, and it was a big decision because we didn't have money at the time, and anyway, we decided to do it. And we did, and lots of funny stories about that. But I wanted to get back to Caserta because the first time we went, it was a gorgeous drive. I remember too, there were trees lined. They subsequently horribly cut them all down. There were these trees that arched, and you went for miles under the tree. Oh, it was so pretty. And Caserta was a really nothing town then. There wasn't a decent hotel, so we always stayed in Naples and drove in. Anyway, the very first day...
It's still like that.
I'm sorry?
It's still like that, unless you stay with Massimo.
Yeah.
Well, we stayed at the Excelsior, which was...
In Napoli.
Yeah.
So many stories about that. I became the official... We used to stay for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and no Americans ever stayed that long in Naples. And so we were kind of freaks, and they took a shine to me, and so I loved to go there because I had a private office. I mean, they gave me everything was at my disposal, including the hotel bus, and I would toot around shopping on the bus. And I'm a great creeper, and I'm a black belt chopper. And
Black belt shopper.
Yeah, and I used to find terrific things, which caught the eye of guys who worked there. So they would prepare lists of what they needed and wait for me to come and do their shopping. We had so much fun. As a matter of fact, there was a young man who was the in charge of baggage. What did they call him?
Portiniere.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
No,
Say
whatever it
portiniere.
was. And he
How
was...
do we say portiniere in English? A bellboy.
Yeah.
No, he wasn't a bellboy. He was in charge of... he was the top bellman, let's say. Anyway, he was a great shopper, and he thought he knew everything about Naples. And he kept promising me that there was this wonderful place he was going to one day take me to, because he knew I was a good creeper, but he said this was impossible to find. So finally the day came, and we're going down the steps of this hellhole, and the guy said, Senora Apfel, because I'd already found it. He was so crushed, it was funny.
Oh, that's hysterical. So you knew before the concierge of the hotel.
Anyway, we were taken, the first day we got to Caserta, to the palace grounds. They were still working on the palace, and they wanted to serve us lunch, and the kitchen wasn't ready, so we ate in the garden. And I'll never forget that, because it was unbelievable. I was starving, and the first course was pasta with a red sauce, and I was used to little dogs coming around the table begging, but I never saw ducks do it. And the ducks would come and quack away until you gave them some pasta. And the red sauce was running down their bill. I'll never forget that as long as I live. And then we went in. They said, well, it was under construction, but they allowed a few people in, and they would take us around. And there was a family of a very working class family. You could see they didn't have very much. There was the mama and papa and a bunch of kids. And Papa was all puffed up, and he came over and he said, in a broken accent, he knew that I was American and we had lots of great things, but you ain't a got this. They were so proud of the fact that they had the palace and what a treasure it was. That's an indelible memory. I'll never forget that.
Now it's UNESCO protected, as is the Setaioli up on San Leo. They're both UNESCO protected.
Oh, that's good. Are the mills still there?
Yeah, a bunch of those are still there. Yes, they are. And let me just add something, to what Iris was saying, that for us, whenever they came over, was always a big feast. There was always a big party, because we had the Americans coming over, and don't forget we were at after the Second World War, and for us, the American rescued us, So it was also, that had a social impact as well. And then we were creating fabrics with them, because they were bringing new ideas, new pattern, new designs. And then we were actually selling fabrics to them and selling fabrics, through them to the White House. For us, it was just astonishing.
And how did you come about to make that choice to select their fabrics to use in the White House, and to you were able to travel all over the world to find fabrics from? Why did you choose
Well,
their
there were
fabrics?
certain fabrics that certain mills could do. Every mill can't do every kind of fabric. And there were many, people don't understand about restorations. Jackie Kennedy did not do the White House. Nobody does the White House. To be historically accurate, a restoration has to be done as closely as possible, even if it's hideous to the way it was. You can't come in and change it. And so we had some of the original swatches from the White House. And I always tried not to redesign or to just get an inspiration from. I replicated the fabrics as close as we could possibly get it. And they made beautiful quality at the mill. And my husband and I always, our work and our life was one and the same. And we liked to work with people we liked, and we got friendly with all these people. A lot of the other buyers just came and left. We were always invited home and met the family, and it was a lot of fun. Your uncle loved a bargain. You remember? Maybe you were too young. Whatever there was that he could find that was very cheap, he would buy a ton of, literally. He had a terrace which was about this size, wasn't it? It was huge.
Yeah, it was huge.
And one year we came and we couldn't get on the terrace. It was piled high with socks. He was telling my husband he got this great deal on socks. So we bought. Another year it was piled high with apples. Whatever he could find. He was just terrific. And he was a very good weaver. And as I say, his wife was terrific. And she would tell me, when I know you're coming, I'm cooking for 10 days. And I take it as a personal insult if you don't eat everything.
What was your favorite dish?
Oh, they were all so good, all so good. But that's where the herba mill came in, because if I didn't have that, I would have collapsed.
You got addicted to the morphine.
Oh, I guess it was the morphine that did it.
Right. And then
She used to make nochilla. She would go up,
Nochillo,
you know that.
So,
The walnut,
walnuts.
no, the hazelnut.
No, walnut.
Walnuts, you go up on the
So
roof.
walnuts liquor.
And it ferments in the sun. It was delicious.
And then, David, I would say that then one of the reasons why the Americans used to come over is because we pioneered the jacquard technique weave. So the fabrics that we were producing were not print fabrics. The design was the result of the intersection of the vertical and horizontal threads, so the weft and the warp. So it was not a print. So that's why the looms that we had were that big that we could reproduce big scale designs. That's why our fabrics are hanging on the walls of pretty important palaces all around the world, and the White House as well. So that was a pretty important and difficult technique. So it was not easy to weave such a fabric.
They did beautiful work, and we were told that the Bourbon Kings had brought French weavers originally to set up the whole works
Yeah.
because they wanted beautiful things, and France made such beautiful fabrics.
So it became part of your family's culture.
Yeah, yes it is. So we've been, working with the Bourbon Kings, during that period, and then even after, Italy was united, I think the Piedmontese, the kings who took over Italy, with the French, they made a big mistakes getting rid of all those people who were, gravitating around the Bourbon Kings, and they made a big mistakes in destroying, most of the things that Bourbon Kings made. But then, after a few years, there was in the 70s, 1870s, 1875, they tried to call all these people back. And so, for example, to us, they gave us an entire mountain called Monte Briano. It's just close to the Royal Palace of Caserta. Now it's a WWF, resort. And we used to take the wood to light the fire for our tanks, because at the time the yarns were dyed in these kind of tanks, so there was not electricity. So they tried to bring all those people back, and so the Alois family, started again in 1885 the production of silk fabrics.
And then how did that evolve into the winemaking?
Yeah, I mean, we have always, Iris remembers, we have always made wine, we were gathering around the table, when they were coming. It was always a big party and a big feast, and we were drinking wine all the time. But at the time, we were making wine just for the family, for our own consumption and for our workers. But then what happened is my father, 30 years ago, he started resurrecting all the ancient vines, the indigenous varietals that the Bourbon Kings were cultivating in the royal garden, because close to the royal garden, of Caserta, they created this big vineyard called La Vigna del Ventaglio, which means a fan vineyard, because the shape of the vineyard had the shape of a fan with 7 different rows and 7 different varietals. And they planted the typical varietals, indigenous varietals of northern Campania, such as Pallagrello Bianco and Pallagrello Nero. So actually they didn't plant the most widely cultivated plants in Campania, but they planted these, varietals that were there in the area, and they repropagated them just because they couldn't stand the fact that the French were coming over with their own, wines. They wanted to have their own varietals, so that's why they planted that. So my father just resurrected them 30 years ago, because phylloxera, which is a disease which destroyed all the vineyards, and then we said the Savoia family, the Piedmontese, they destroyed all the vineyards that the Bourbon Kings set up.
Was Raphael involved with
Exactly, Raffaele was, yeah. Raffaele is my grandfather. So Raffaele was, he was.
He was your grandfather?
Yeah, Raffaele was my grandfather, and then Raffaele, maybe you mean my brother's brother, So I'm sorry, my father's brother.
Raffaello was married to
Angelina.
Oh, and he was your grandfather.
Yeah, no,
Then
he
I
was
take
my
it-
uncle. I'm sorry.
Oh,
he
your
was
uncle,
my uncle.
yes, that's what you said
so
before. That's
Angelina's
why uncle.
husband is my uncle. Yeah, and now Antonio, his son, he keeps producing fabrics. That's what he's doing right now.
This is your cousin.
Yeah, it's my cousin,
Alois.
Antonio Alois. Yeah, that's
Because
what he's doing right now.
Raphael in the old days made some pretty awful wine.
Yeah.
As a matter of
actually-
fact, I tell you the truth. I loved your wine, and I was afraid to drink. I was afraid to open the
Yeah.
bottle. I was telling my
You are
housekeeper, "Oh my God, the last time, it was a long, long time ago. Raffaello sent some wine over. My husband said, "Oh my God,
Yeah.
I'm afraid it's going to explode in
totally.
the bottle."
That's totally true.
It's
We-
very interesting that you bring that up, because
Yeah.
as a little boy, Massimo actually explained how a lot of this was destroyed. It was destroyed, one, through the Piedmont family, the House of Savoy, who wanted to destroy vestiges of the Bourbons, so they destroyed grapes, vineyards. Also phylloxera. phylloxera, which was a fungal disease which came to south of Italy in the 1890s, destroyed a lot of vines. And then the war. So Massimo brought up the war, and in the 50s, this area of Italy was saved by Americans as Germans were retreating. And it was right at that time when the Italians switched sides during the armistice in September 1943 that our families were very much disrupted
Yeah.
by what was happening between the Allies and the Americans. And when the Germans retreated, they burned a lot of farmland,
Yeah.
and they slaughtered all the animals so they could leave the local population in the hands of the Americans, having to take care of them as a Red Cross so that it would slow down their retreat. At the time, we loved wine so much, so we made do because we're known as being resourceful people. Massimo's family probably made one of the worst wines in the time. We all did. And we were all forced to drink this wine, and which is the reason why now, when we've rediscovered these wines, which his father has done, and has found a way to bring back the beauty of once time existed in
yes.
that. These wines are much better than the wine that you may have tasted in the
Oh my
50s.
God, there's no comparison.
Yeah, yeah. But let me just tell you, we were making wine in a very simple way because, as you said, after the Second World War, we actually didn't really have a scientific reference, you know, so we didn't know what to do. So we were trying to figure out what to do. So we started in the 50s, you know, to discover the new techniques, the modern techniques, in order to make a good wine. And so, of course, it took time, because by the time you plant the vineyard and you wait at least 15 years in order to have good grapes, and then you want to vinify them and you want to age them, because those are, you know, grapes which have the structure and the strength to be aged throughout the years. So, I mean, you have 30 years which have gone like that.
So Massimo, the mountain that you're talking about that was given back to the Bourbons, tell us about the Pontelatone plot and how that came to wind up in your hands.
Yeah.
And has Iris ever seen this hunting ground?
I don't know, you should ask her. I mean, I remember my aunt and my uncle and my father taking you all around the
Yeah.
places, you know, so she must have been there, because that was the place where the Bourbon Kings used to hunt. So, and there was, you know, a pretty old, ancient farmhouse where the Bourbon Kings used to stop, you know, and rest. Because don't forget that Ferdinando IV, when he became king, he was just 7 years old. So, and he was all actually living in Caserta, in the royal palace of Caserta, and they were taking him all around the places because he was a young kid. So that's why in the northern Campania, the Bourbon Kings were always
Where is
traveling.
the church? It was on the top of it.
San Leucio.
San Lucia.
Yeah, San Leucio. Actually, San Leucio, around the church, the Bourbon Kings built the manufacturing plant. They built the house for the workers of the company, you know, of their factory. So that
remember-
was San Leucio.
Going to that church because I got a call. It was Ferragosto. I think it was the first day, and my grandmother had passed away. We were very close, but I couldn't get out. You know how it was then. And so I went to the church and lit a candle, I remember. It was a little church on the top.
Saint Sylvester, maybe.
Maybe it could have been San Silvestro as well. San Silvestro is the mountain that was given to us, you know, by the Savoia for 99 years.
Which is the patron saint of Caserta. But
Yeah.
let's get back to Pontelatone.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, Caserta, you have great roots there with the Bourbon King, but your Pontelatone plot of land is off the Via Appia. And the Via Appia is an old Roman highway, which
Exactly.
brought people from Rome to Brindisi. And along the Via Appia, there's lots of Roman ruins. In fact, very close to your vineyard, there's more Roman ruins than there probably are in the San Leucio area.
Exactly.
And in that area, I also know there's a little church in Sant'Angelo in Formis called the Byzantine Church, which is 900, was built in 900 based on a Roman temple to
Exactly.
I think Diana. And the village that my parents come from, Bellona, is the name of a Roman goddess of war.
Yeah.
So on the other side, you have this Pontelatone, which was known as Caleonum by the Romans, and you have both limestone and volcanic.
Exactly.
So let's talk more about the Bacchanalian background
Yeah.
of what you have now, because I think what you have now is a tremendous treasure, more so than the actual silks of yesterday.
Oh, yeah. So don't forget that the Bourbon kings are the ones who started to excavate Pompeii. So they found Pompeii, and so it's under their kingdom, that they started to resurrect Pompeii. So they knew that Pliny the Elder, the pretty famous historian, was making reference to the 2,000 years ago to the area where we are, because at chapter 14 of this big encyclopedia, which talks about wine and geography and food, he was making reference to the area where we are, saying three are the good areas, where they produce good wine. One is Falernum, the other one is Caulinum, the one you were mentioning, and the other one is Trebulanum, the Ager Trebulanum. So the Bourbon kings knew that. So that's why they resurrected all the indigenous varietals of the area and they planted them, in their royal vineyard. And in Ponte Latone, actually, 30 years ago, they could find these big Prephyloxera trees from which the professors of the university took the cuttings to repropagate in that area, in the area where the Bourbon kings used to hunt and live, actually. So the area is pretty interesting because of the soil, as you said. So it's volcanic soil. It's pretty interesting because in the 20,000 years ago, after the big eruption of Campi Flegrei, all the area was covered by ashes. And these ashes then, through the years, they came down the valley where we are. So all the soil that we have are volcanic soil. So because we are pretty close to Mount Vesuvius. So I think this is one of those reasons why the vineyards really, they developed and they can really grow, in a proper way, in a healthy way, because of this pretty interesting soil.
So I have a question for both of you, which is, how does it feel to be here in the offices of the Wall Street Journal and remembering the stories of your past, your families? How does that feel for both of you?
It's interesting. It's wistful. I'm thinking of so many little flashbacks, like sitting at lunch during one of the long siestas, Angelina's oh my God, fabulous lunch. And at the time, Frank Sinatra's record of Strangers in the Night. All the Italians were crazy about it, and they kept playing it over and over and over. I just can't get that out of my head. And lots of things. I remember the mozzarella, and Raffaele had a good friend who had a laboratorio to make mozzarella, and he used to make it for us in little bite size. And every time we left from Naples to go back to New York, they would come to the boat with big crocks of the mozzarella. And you're not allowed to bring it into the country, so they let us take it aboard. And I used to spend my whole dinner hour on the ship going on peddling this mozzarella. Please eat some, because what am I going to do with it? It was so delicious. So delicious.
Nowadays, you can get that same mozzarella, which comes from a lot of the places they called latticini freschi, and a lot of them are along the Via Appia, not far from his vineyard. And you could get them at Italy.
Oh, I don't go down. I've never been there. I always want to go.
Italy?
No.
You could even buy it online, probably from Cidarella's.
Well, you could buy it online if you knew how to do it.
There is a little town called Vidulazio, which is next to this.
So on the other side of the hill?
The other side of the hill, and in Vidulazio, on the Via Appia, there are two good.
I solved my problem by discovering burrata, which I like better, so I get
it's a
that.
little richer.
Yeah,
so obviously you have very good taste.
But
Whereas mozzarella is not as rich as the
Well,
burrata.
mozzarella sometimes, as my husband would say, tastes like foam rubber.
If you get
Not
the
good
wrong one.
mozzarella.
But,
But,
the difference is when you go to Caserta or you go to Ponte Latone, so now you have to go. You have to get on the next plane and go visit. And
I will come and pick you up with my carriage and the
Oh,
horses.
goody, goody.
He'll treat you to mozzarella.
Yeah, because I remember Carl saying, when I was when we were working together at the D&D building, I remember him telling me the story about my grandfather coming with his carriage and with his horses at the train station in Caserta, because actually we were coming from Civitavecchia, you know, by train, and he was coming to pick you up with that. So that's it's pretty hilarious.
They would go by horse and carriage from Caserta to Civitavecchia.
No, from Caserta to San Leucio, because they were coming from Civitavecchia by train. That's what Carl was telling me, and then they were picked up in Caserta, going to San Leucio, up to San Leucio.
Well, the very first time we went to Caserta was with a competitor of yours. Who was his?
We have Bologna, as you mentioned,
No.
and the other is De Negri.
De Negri.
Yeah, those are the three family.
It was
pretty
the son
important
who was a doctor.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he came.
Yeah.
He had a new Mercedes.
Yeah.
And he was a speed demon. And he was going so fast, I thought I was scared to death. So I was sitting in the back, I tapped him on the shoulder, and I couldn't speak a word of Italian then. And I tried to make him understand that I wanted him to slow down. So he said, and he reached in, and he handed me a box of Dramamine. I never thought I'd get there alive.
But you did. And here you are. And how does it feel for you?
Yeah, I remember for us, as I said, it was a big party, a big feast. So we were really, whenever we knew that they were coming over, we wanted to be, involved around the table, and it was good because there was, it was business, but on the other side, it was a good human relationship, because we were staying with them for a pretty long time. It was not just a day or just few hours like it happens today, that in few hours and few minutes you just burn what you are doing, but we were staying together for a couple of weeks. So I remember that was pretty good for us.
I think that comes from just loving what you do, right? And having it be part, like organically, of who you are, as Iris was saying about how her life, her professional life, and her personal life were one there with Carl. They were integrated completely, and I think that's actually how the richest experiences in life are, is when our work and our personal life meld together and give us such richness and pleasure.
It was amazing how much we accomplished with language, even though there was a language barrier. Mm-hmm. But I learned again, the first day I was in Caserta, we went to, I don't remember, it was almost somebody's mill, and they got they couldn't speak a word of English, and I couldn't speak a word of Italian. So they got an interpreter. I'll never forget him. He was very short. He had red hair that was graying. It was parted in the middle. It was like this. He had little Benjamin Franklin eyeglasses, and he had a little dictionary, Italian, English dictionary. And he was always going, but he couldn't find any of the textile words.
Good.
I mean, it was just useless. But he was consoling himself. I'll never forget this either. He had a cucumber in his pocket. And he would, every time he thought nobody was looking, he would take some cucumber and look at the book again. And we got no place. But I found out then that if you're passionate about something, you can really communicate without words. We really got on. We understood one another with texture and color and everything else. It was a very interesting
despite
experience.
the language barriers.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really
Exactly, because Raffaele never learned English.
Yeah, I mean, just my uncle Franco, he learned English during when the Americans were there, because they stayed there a couple of years, and so.
But he wasn't always around.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, we managed. So.
Yeah.
He learned English from American soldiers.
So American soldiers.
He probably knew a lot of the little songs that they would sing. Well, today, David.
This is.
I wanted to wrap it up, but today was really more about people on the brink of discovery. And Iris, for you to go to an area of Italy like that after the war in the 50s where the local dialect is extremely difficult to understand by any foreigner. And to find the beauty in the area is something that I very much respect about what you've done. And Massimo, what you are doing in the area right now to bring back the heritage and the biological aspect of your vineyard. I was very impressed with your vineyard. And I think that oftentimes people ask me, you're from Campania, oh, you're from Napoli. They get very confused. They don't know the various areas. And they say, I'm going to Naples, or I'm going to Capri, or they say Capri. I say, I want to visit a local vineyard. So I thought it would be right for me to visit one of these local vineyards first before I was actually ever giving the advice.
Are there many?
There are others. They're in the area that Massimo's family has their vineyard is known as Terra del Volturno, and because most of the irrigation comes from the Volturno River. And there's another vineyard not far from there that's actually known as Terra del Volturno that does a very good Pellegrillo.
Yeah.
And the area was originally known for Solopaca grapes, however, for many, many years. And then Massimo's family rediscovering the actual Pellegrillo grape and the Casavecchia grape is a great feat of our heritage going back to Pliny in ancient Rome. But there's other areas of Campania like Avellino that does phenomenal archaeological wines that actually was the forefront of putting a lot of these Greco-Roman wines onto the market with Fiano di Avellino and Greco di Tufo and another one called
Taurasi.
Aglianico, which
Taurasi.
Aglianico is a translation from Greek meaning Hellenico, so it was more of a Greco wine that the Greeks planted in what was known as Magna Graecia.
Is Falangina from the same
Yeah,
region?
yeah.
Falangina is a varietal of Fiano di Avellino. Now,
Delicious wine.
Yeah.
we're not from Avellino, which is another province in Campania. We're from Caserta, which is the one time known as province of Napoli before the war. Mussolini had the foresight to make it its own province. But we also grow Fiano and Falangina in the area, and actually the whole area going up north towards Rome along the Palatina, you'll see Falangina and mozzarella stores everywhere. But what I found very attractive about your vineyard is the roots that you've discovered, the beauty of it, and how well you're maintaining it. And I recommend the vineyard to anyone who travels to Napoli. If you have time, go to Caserta, visit Massimo. He'll open up the doors for you, and you'll get the royal treatment, and you'll feel like a Bourbon king.
Well, thank you all for coming together
Yeah.
today.
Let me just express my gratitude, for being here today. Thank you, Iris. I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
that.
Thank you.
Really honored.
It was great
Thanks a lot.
fun. Thank you.
Thanks a
Nice
lot.
to see you
Thanks
again
a
after
lot.
all these years.
Thanks a lot.